Page 206, Lesson 19, Reading. A was an archer who shot at a frog. B was a butcher and had a great dog. C was a captain, all covered with lace. D was a drunkard and had a red face. E was an esquire, with pride on his brow. F was a farmer, and followed the plough. G was a gamester, who had but ill luck. H was a hunter, and hunted a buck. I was an innkeeper, who loved to carouse. J was a joiner, and built up a house. K was King William, once governed this land. L was a lady, who had a white hand. M was a miser, and hoarded up gold. N was a nobleman, gallant and bold. O was an oyster girl, and went about town. P was a parson, and wore a black gown. Q was a queen, who wore a silk slip. R was a robber, and wanted a whip. S was a sailor, and spent all he got. T was a tinker, and mended a pot. U was a usurer, a miserable elf. V was a vintner, who drank all himself. W was a watchman, and guarded the door. X was expensive, and so became poor. Y was a youth that did not love school. Z was a zany, a poor harmless fool. Questions and answers. Was the letter you received an anonymous letter? Yes, the letter I received was an anonymous letter. Was the letter you received an anonymous letter? No, the letter I received was not an anonymous letter. Page 208. Was your professor an atheist? Yes, my professor was an atheist. Was your professor an atheist? No, my professor was not an atheist. Was this multimillionaire a bankrupt 10 years ago? Yes, this multimillionaire was a bankrupt 10 years ago. Was this multimillionaire a bankrupt 10 years ago? No, this multimillionaire was not a bankrupt 10 years ago. Was his autobiography interesting? Yes, his autobiography was interesting. Was his autobiography interesting? No, his autobiography was not interesting. Were the poems in manuscript for a very long time? Yes, the poems were in manuscript for a very long time. Were the poems in manuscript for a very long time? No, the poems were not in manuscript for a very long time. Was he in the Legislative Assembly? Yes, he was in the Legislative Assembly. Was he in the Legislative Assembly? No, he was not in the Legislative Assembly. Was his father a specialist in criminal law? Yes, his father was a specialist in criminal law. Was his father a specialist in criminal law? No, his father was not a specialist in criminal law. Was the catalog he sent you an old one? Yes, the catalog he sent me was an old one. Was the catalog he sent you an old one? No, the catalog he sent me was not an old one. Was your grandfather a linguist? Yes, my grandfather was a linguist. Was your grandfather a linguist? No, my grandfather was not a linguist. Were the inhabitants of the island cannibals? Yes, the inhabitants of the island were cannibals. Were the inhabitants of the island cannibals? No, the inhabitants of the island were not cannibals. Was his portable typewriter a German-made one? Yes, his portable typewriter was a German-made one. Was his portable typewriter a German-made one? No, his portable typewriter was not a German-made one. Was the plant you saw yesterday a parasite? Yes, the plant I saw yesterday was a parasite. Was the plant you saw yesterday a parasite? No, the plant I saw yesterday was not a parasite. Was the late General Peter White a veteran? Yes, the late General Peter White was a veteran. Was the late General Peter White a veteran? No, the late General Peter White was not a veteran. Was his father an optimist? Yes, his father was an optimist. Was his father an optimist? No, his father was not an optimist. Was her mother a pessimist? Yes, her mother was a pessimist. Was her mother a pessimist? No, her mother was not a pessimist. Were they voluntary workers? Yes, they were voluntary workers. Were they voluntary workers? No, they were not voluntary workers. Was he a volunteer for service in the Army? Yes, he was a volunteer for service in the Army. Was he a volunteer for service in the Army? No, he was not a volunteer for service in the Army. Were you at a vegetarian restaurant yesterday? Yes, I was at a vegetarian restaurant yesterday. Were you at a vegetarian restaurant yesterday? No, I was not at a vegetarian restaurant yesterday. Page 210. Was your uncle a spokesman of the government last year? Yes, my uncle was a spokesman of the government last year. Was your uncle a spokesman of the government last year? No, my uncle was not a spokesman of the government last year. Was the pedestrian killed in a traffic accident your friend? Yes, the pedestrian killed in a traffic accident was my friend. Was the pedestrian killed in a traffic accident your friend? No, the pedestrian killed in a traffic accident was not my friend. Was your mother an invalid for 2 years? Yes, my mother was an invalid for 2 years. Was your mother an invalid for 2 years? No, my mother was not an invalid for 2 years. Was the chairman happy with the unanimous vote? Yes, the chairman was happy with the unanimous vote. Was the chairman happy with the unanimous vote? No, the chairman was not happy with the unanimous vote. Was that spinster alone and lonely last night? Yes, that spinster was alone and lonely last night. Was that spinster alone and lonely last night? No, that spinster was not alone and lonely last night. Were you an amateur photographer? Yes, I was an amateur photographer. Were you an amateur photographer? No, I was not an amateur photographer. Was your brother a professional photographer? Yes, my brother was a professional photographer. Was your brother a professional photographer? No, my brother was not a professional photographer. Was this aesthetic a sinful man many years ago? Yes, this aesthetic was a sinful man many years ago. Was this aesthetic a sinful man many years ago? No, this aesthetic was not a sinful man many years ago. Was he a professor of geology? Yes, he was a professor of geology. Was he a professor of geology? No, he was not a professor of geology. Was her husband a student of philosophy? Yes, her husband was a student of philosophy. Was her husband a student of philosophy? No, her husband was not a student of philosophy. Was our principal a famous astronomer? Yes, our principal was a famous astronomer. Was our principal a famous astronomer? No, our principal was not a famous astronomer. Was our governor a capitalist? Yes, our governor was a capitalist. Was our governor a capitalist? No, our governor was not a capitalist. Was the medicine he took yesterday poisonous? Yes, the medicine he took yesterday was poisonous. Was the medicine he took yesterday poisonous? No, the medicine he took yesterday was not poisonous. Was the story he told you queer? Yes, the story he told me was queer. Was the story he told you queer? No, the story he told me was not queer. Were our weapons and ammunition in great quantities? Yes, our weapons and ammunition were in great quantities. Page 212. Were our weapons and ammunition in great quantities? No, our weapons and ammunition were not in great quantities. Was your grandfather well versed in the arts? Yes, my grandfather was well versed in the arts. Was your grandfather well versed in the arts? No, my grandfather was not well versed in the arts. Was he an admirer of fine arts? Yes, he was an admirer of fine arts. Was he an admirer of fine arts? No, he was not an admirer of fine arts. Was help lacking during the storm? Yes, help was lacking during the storm. Was help lacking during the storm? No, help was not lacking during the storm. Was his foolishness without bounds? Yes, his foolishness was without bounds. Was his foolishness without bounds? No, his foolishness was not without bounds. Was the temple full of devotees yesterday? Yes, the temple was full of devotees yesterday. Was the temple full of devotees yesterday? No, the temple was not full of devotees yesterday. Was our late rector a man of extensive knowledge? Yes, our late rector was a man of extensive knowledge. Was our late rector a man of extensive knowledge? No, our late rector was not a man of extensive knowledge. Was it a clerical error? Yes, it was a clerical error. Was it a clerical error? No, it was not a clerical error. Was he in solitude for many years? Yes, he was in solitude for many years. Was he in solitude for many years? No, he was not in solitude for many years. Was the child abnormal? Yes, the child was abnormal. Was the child abnormal? No, the child was not abnormal. Was the story full of exaggerations? Yes, the story was full of exaggerations. Was the story full of exaggerations? No, the story was not full of exaggerations. Was he a diligent worker? Yes, he was a diligent worker. Was he a diligent worker? No, he was not a diligent worker. Was he a brilliant scientist? Yes, he was a brilliant scientist. Was he a brilliant scientist? No, he was not a brilliant scientist. Were they civilized people? Yes, they were civilized people. Were they civilized people? No, they were not civilized people. Was your language teacher fluent in 5 languages? Yes, my language teacher was fluent in 5 languages. Was your language teacher fluent in 5 languages? No, my language teacher was not fluent in 5 languages. Was the man easily excited? Yes, the man was easily excited. Was the man easily excited? No, the man was not easily excited. Was the judge free from prejudice? Yes, the judge was free from prejudice. Was the judge free from prejudice? No, the judge was not free from prejudice. Was the monk indifferent to pains and pleasures of life? Yes, the monk was indifferent to pains and pleasures of life. Page 214. Was the monk indifferent to pains and pleasures of life? No, the monk was not indifferent to pains and pleasures of life.